I was guiding visitors through the ancient streets of Pompeii when an American man looked around at the preserved ruins and frowned. He asked me, completely serious, when Italy planned to clear away the broken stones and rebuild the place properly. He explained that back home, something this old would be turned into an immersive attraction with actors, sound effects, and ticket upgrades. He even leaned in and told me I should pass the idea to the government, calling it a guaranteed money machine. I remember standing there staring at a city, frozen by a volcano, thinking how strange it was to hear history described as wasted real estate. A relative of mine is a tea master in Kyoto and hosts traditional ceremonies that are quiet and deliberate. In the middle of one session, an American woman wrinkled her nose and complained that the tea tasted too earthy and bitter. She reached into her bag, pulled out a packet of artificial sweetener, and stirred it straight into the bowl. Smiling proudly, she told the master that adding sweetness would make customers happier, and that this approach worked wonders for big coffee chains in the US. I watched the room fall silent, the calm atmosphere dissolving into disbelief. While I was working behind the bar at an old pub in Munich, an American guest loudly announced that Germany's beer laws were killing creativity. He launched into a speech about how American brewers were superior because they experimented with flavors like mango, chocolate, and even decorative sparkles. He insisted that Germans were trapped in the past and would never be taken seriously until they embraced bold innovation. I wiped down the counter slowly, wondering how centuries of brewing tradition suddenly needed a lecture from a guy holding a novelty IPA. On a boat trip around the Galapagos Islands, an American tourist grew annoyed that the animals weren't cooperating. He asked the guide why the sea lions weren't trained to clap or pose, and why the tortoises didn't come closer on command. Then he suggested that the government should set up something like a marine theme park to make the wildlife more engaging. Listening to him talk about training endangered animals for selfies, I realized he had missed the entire point of being there. During a cooking class in Chiang Mai, an American participant refused to use freshly pressed coconut milk. He claimed it was unsafe and demanded a canned low-fat version instead, insisting it was healthier. He then lectured the elderly Thai chef about cholesterol and saturated fats, quoting an article he had read online. I watched a woman who had cooked this way her entire life nod politely while being corrected by someone who trusted packaging more than tradition. In a linguistics lecture in Cairo, an American exchange student raised his hand to argue that Arabic writing was overly complicated. He suggested replacing it entirely with the Latin alphabet so Westerners could do business more easily. He framed it as progress and modernization, unable to understand why the professor and students reacted with shock. I sat there feeling the weight of centuries of language dismissed in a single confident paragraph. A friend of mine works in urban planning in Amsterdam and once met an American consultant who had big ideas. He proposed draining the canals and replacing them with underground highways, complete with slides showing traffic improvements and economic gains. He described the canals as charming but outdated obstacles to becoming a truly modern city. Hearing about it later, I imagined Amsterdam without water and felt something essential quietly vanish. At a flamenco show in Seville, an American man in the front row kept sighing dramatically. During the break, he approached the musicians and told them the music felt messy and overly emotional. He suggested adding a simple, steady drum beat like rock music to make it easier for international audiences to enjoy. He spoke as if offering a gift, while the performer stood there wondering how passion had become a flaw. On a hiking tour in the Swiss Alps, an American guest complained non-stop about the lack of guardrails. He warned our guide that lawyers in the US would shut this place down instantly and called it a massive liability problem. For the next hour, he explained how nature needed safeguards to protect people from themselves. I looked out at the mountains and thought about how freedom and danger often share the same path. While visiting a Maasai village in Kenya on a cultural exchange, an American tourist began explaining property ownership to the elders. He insisted communal land was holding them back, and that fencing off private plots was the only path to prosperity. He spoke passionately about the American dream, unaware of how arrogant it sounded. The villagers listened quietly, and the silence said more than words ever could. I once worked at a bookstore in Dublin when an American customer asked for a novel by James Joyce. I handed him a copy of Ulysses, and he flipped through it with irritation. He told me he needed an Americanized version because the language was confusing and full of strange expressions. When I said this was the original text, he shook his head and called it unreadable. I remember thinking how strange it was to hear literature blamed for not adapting. At our office in Bangalore, a visiting American software engineer decided our lunch break needed fixing. He called a meeting to explain that eating together for an hour was inefficient and proposed desk lunches with packaged sandwiches in 15 minutes. He presented charts and productivity claims, ignoring the importance of shared meals. Watching him talk, I realized efficiency means different things depending on what you value. On a vineyard tour in Bordeaux, an American visitor told the winemaker that aging wine in oak barrels was outdated. He explained how oak chips and flavor extracts in California sped things up and ensured consistency. He advised switching methods to stay competitive globally. The winemaker smiled politely, and I wondered how patience had become something to eliminate. At a rural Japanese onsen, an American tourist refused to enter the bath. He loudly declared communal nude bathing unhygienic and backward, then lectured everyone through an embarrassed translator about private showers and antibacterial soap. He was eventually asked to leave. The steam rose quietly as calm returned, and I thought about how comfort zones rarely travel well. My sister, who curates a museum in Athens, once dealt with an American visitor who was upset that the Parthenon wasn't complete. He assumed the government lacked funds and suggested starting a fundraiser back home to finish it with a roof and modern windows. He spoke enthusiastically about improvements, unaware he was proposing to erase history. She listened patiently, the marble columns standing silently behind her. While trekking in Nepal, an American traveler offered business advice to our Sherpa guide. He said the prayer flags cluttered the scenery and suggested replacing them with sponsored motivational banners for revenue. He described it as a smart branding opportunity. I looked at the mountains and felt the absurdity settle in like thin air. In a cafe in Vienna, I overheard an American complaining that the city's famous cake was too rich. He told the waiter that Austrian bakers should learn from massive dessert chains in the US, praising variety and oversized portions. He called focusing on one traditional cake a weak business strategy. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching tradition defend itself without speaking. At a company meeting in Seoul, an American executive questioned the custom of bowing. He told our CEO that a strong handshake was the only professional greeting and tried to demonstrate by grabbing his hand. The room froze as he forced the gesture, convinced he was showing respect. The discomfort lingered long after the meeting ended. On a whale-watching tour in Iceland, an American tourist grew bored waiting. He asked if feeding the whales might bring them closer for better photos. When told it was harmful and illegal, he sighed and complained that trained animals were more entertaining. I watched the ocean roll quietly, indifferent to customer satisfaction. At a night market in Taipei, an American visitor criticized the layout of the stalls. He suggested reorganizing everything into neat rows like a mall food court, with sections for each course. He spoke about efficiency while standing in the middle of vibrant chaos. I realized some people see order where others see life. Working at a traditional espresso bar in Rome, I once faced an American woman who tried to order a complex, customized drink. When I explained we served only classic coffee, she looked at me sympathetically and offered to write down her order so we could modernize. She said it was what people really wanted. I watched her leave, the counter unchanged and perfectly content. My uncle owns a small vineyard in Argentina, and during a tasting, an American guest told him his wine was fine but incomplete. He suggested producing sweet pink wine instead, insisting that's what sells in the US. He advised focusing on volume, not craftsmanship. My uncle nodded politely, the vines outside rooted firmly in their soil. In a classical music course in Vienna, an American student argued that composers like Mozart would have thrived more if born in America. He said capitalism would have forced them to write shorter, catchier pieces for mass appeal. He talked about producers and hits, and I wondered how silence ever competed with sales. On a tour through the Australian outback, a tourist from Florida complained about the red dirt. He suggested planting green grass and installing sprinklers to make it more attractive. He talked about lawns-like solutions, and I stared at the endless land, thinking about how little it needed approval. At a ramen shop in Tokyo, an American family struggled with chopsticks. The father called over the chef and sincerely suggested inventing noodles designed for forks. He described it as a revolutionary business idea for global success. The chef bowed slightly, and the world kept turning. A German friend once drove an American colleague on the Autobahn. The American gripped the door handle, accusing him of recklessness, and explained that speed limits were a sign of civilization. He called the German system outdated and dangerous. The road stretched ahead, unconcerned with his fear. In a spice market in Jaipur, an American tourist lectured a vendor about hygiene. He warned that selling spices openly invited lawsuits and advised sealing everything in plastic. He sanitized his hands dramatically as proof. I watched the spices glow in the sun, untouched by his concern. In Madrid, an American visitor was furious about shops closing for siesta. He told a shop owner that working non-stop was the only path to success and that the country needed to adopt American hours to fix its economy. The shopkeeper listened calmly, unlocking his door on his own schedule. At the pyramids in Giza, an American asked why there wasn't an elevator. He called the climb unsafe and suggested adding shops and cafes at the top to boost revenue. Standing beneath stones older than his country, I felt the weight of time laugh quietly. In an office in Sweden, a new American manager tried to cancel the daily fika break. He called it wasted time and promoted desk coffee instead. The team calmly explained it wasn't optional. Watching him struggle to understand, I learned how culture resists optimization. In Peru, an American watched a woman weaving on a traditional loom and told her she was doing it the hard way. He showed her a website for factory blankets and talked about automation. She smiled gently, hands never stopping. In a souk in Marrakesh, an American refused to haggle, calling it unprofessional. He offered to teach fixed pricing systems like in the US. The shopkeeper listened politely, the market humming all around them. After a ballet in St. Petersburg, I overheard an American complain that the story was hard to follow. He suggested spoken dialogue like Broadway would improve it, calling silent dance outdated. The dancers bowed, the story already told. In an Irish pub in County Clare, an American kept requesting Southern rock songs. When refused, he said all the local music sounded the same and suggested adding American classics. The musicians smiled and kept playing. On a coffee farm in Colombia, an American advised switching from Arabica to Robusta for caffeine and profit. He talked about energy drinks and market potential. The farmer listened, surrounded by beans grown for flavor, not haste. In a Chinese history class, an American student called the Great Wall a failure because it didn't stop invasions. He proposed modern tech solutions and cost efficiency. He spoke confidently, correcting centuries with a startup mindset. At a Shinto shrine in Japan, an American told a priest the wooden buildings should be replaced with steel and concrete for safety. He talked about permanence, missing the meaning of renewal. In a butcher shop in Florence, an American was horrified by whole chickens. He called it unsanitary and suggested American packaging standards. The butcher kept cutting, unmoved. On safari in South Africa, an American asked why the grass wasn't trimmed. He suggested mowing it like a golf course for better views. The savannah stretched on, wild and unconcerned. In a crowded market in Bangkok, an American complained about the lack of order and began directing foot traffic. He explained that America had systems for this kind of thing. People flowed around him anyway, the chaos working just fine.